everybody thinks that their past doesn't affect them, and that they're fine, that they're over the past. I remember talking to a young man who said that women reminded him of his mother, and so in his case, his past still affected him. I remember another woman who continued to get into the relationship with the wrong man. They're always abusive. They were just not the right kind of person to be with. And so then I asked her, well, what about this guy over here? Everybody else seems to like him. He seems interesting, right? And she said, oh, John, he's too boring. And I said, well, what's wrong with him? She said, oh, well, he doesn't have, it seems like he didn't have that spice that she was looking for. When I tried to understand what that spice was, it was she was used to people who loved her as being volatile and abusive, and that was the kind of person she was accustomed to. And so if she ever met somebody who was not like that, it was an unfamiliar feeling. So I call that having a broken picker. People keep going to the wrong kind of relationships because they haven't healed their past wounds. So whenever you hear people say or talk about mommy issues or daddy issues, they're actually talking about a theory of personality that dates back to Freud. And we're going to talk about how the past affects our present. In this lesson, we're going to look at theories of personality, such as Freud's and people that follow him, and attachment theory and object relations theory, and how all these things affect our personality. The main point of the lesson today is that our relationships with others and how we define ourselves is strongly influenced by our past experiences. So in this lesson, you will identify the basic concepts of psychoanalytic theories of personality. You'll differentiate psychoanalysis from neo-Freudian theorists, and you'll understand how our past experiences shape our perception of ourselves and others. So let's start with a developmental approach to personality. In the previous chapter, we looked at the traditional views of personality that stress the nature side of personality, such as biology and trait theories. Personality can also be seen as developing through its interaction with the environment rather than as static and predetermined. Thus, this chapter takes a developmental approach to personality. So first of all, let's talk about human development and what is a developmental approach. Human development refers to predictable changes over time throughout the course of the lifespan in the physical structure, thought, or behavior of a person as a result of both biological and environmental influences. Developmental periods or stages are discrete periods of the lifespan during which predictable changes occur. So if you think about it, some examples of developmental stages are early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, middle adulthood, and elderly or older adults and seniors. So those are typical stages throughout the lifespan. And each stage has a predictable change that happens. And so we want to also look at how personality develops over time. So let's talk about the domains of human development. In the previous chapter, we looked at several domains related to human development. First, we talked about the biological or physical domain that includes those aspects of development that involve changes in physical shape and size, as well as changes in brain structure, sensory capabilities, and motor skills. But the personality domain includes, like the trait theories that we talked about, includes those aspects of development that involve acquiring relatively stable and enduring traits, as well as a sense of self as an individual. These domains tend to stress the role of nature in wiring our behavior, but they tend to overlook the cognitive mental processes involved in the development of personality. So we're going to talk about that in this chapter. The theory domains that tend to stress a more environmental approach can be divided into two broad categories, focusing on the observable changes in human development. Those are the cognitive domains. The cognitive domain includes the aspects of development that involve the acquisition of skills in perceiving, thinking, reasoning, and problem solving, as well as the intricate development and use of language. Then there's the socio-cultural domain. Those include aspects of development that are comprised of our socialization and our enculturation into the larger society. We have to understand that the domains of development are arbitrary segments of development. Changes and continuities in each domain interact with the changes and continuities in all the other domains. So they're typically a bit arbitrary, but we try to use these paradigms to understand personality development. So, for example, cognitive development we might talk about cognitive development, but it's also greatly impacted by biological changes in the brain, and cognitions are also impacted by our environment and society. So let's talk about how do biology and environment interact. In the previous chapter, as I said, we talked a lot about the role of biology, but let's also look at how it interacts with the environment. So both biological and environmental factors, or nature and nurture, interact as humans develop. Biological factors are the genetic, neurological, or physical conditions that affect the development of an individual. Environmental factors are the specific situations that an individual experiences and that influence behavior and development. So nature and nurture, biology and environment, they both play a role. An interactive approach says that the interaction of the following factors shapes each person's unique personality development. Those include biological personality traits, environmental and cultural factors. We're going to look at society and culture in the next chapter. But in this chapter, we're going to just look at how our past and our environment affects our personality. So let's look at the role of nurture, or the social environment, in personality. We're going to look at some traditional theories that involve nurture. Our understanding of personality and development is based on science and is guided by theory. So what is a theory? It's an organized, coherent set of ideas that helps us to understand, explain, and make predictions. Theories are based on data, the results from a scientific investigation, and data are often expressed as numbers, but they may take other forms. And so, as we will see, many of the theories that we saw may have been based on case studies, not necessarily on numbers. In addition to biologically based theories in the previous chapter, theories that stress the nurture side of human development and personality are traditionally categorized into the following groups. These include psychodynamic theories, behavioral theories, cognitive or social cognitive theories, and humanistic theories. We're going to talk about it in the next chapter, in the next few chapters, I should say. These theories of personality attempt to explain why we are the way we are by looking at our past experiences and how we are consciously or unconsciously developing in the present. So again, it's looking at the past and how it affects the present. So the first main thing we need to know is the psychodynamic theories of personality development, and that is largely due to Sigmund Freud. So we're going to focus on Sigmund Freud's conception of personality for a large part. The psychodynamic views generally trace their ideas back to the work of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was the founder of the psychoanalytic movement, and he taught that personality development is determined by unconscious processes. Freud theorized a structure of the mind to include three parts. There is the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. The preconscious is somewhat unconscious, but is not repressed and can easily become conscious. And so it's thought to be like a subconscious or memory that's temporary, that can be brought into immediate awareness when it's accessed. Whereas the unconscious is deeper and more repressed, and it's harder to really know. Freud emphasized the important role of early childhood development and our past experiences. So Freud believed that adult personality was heavily influenced by events that occurred in early childhood. And so you might think about some experiences in your own life that contributed to the way you are today. Freud introduced structural theory, which has a tripartite, it's called a tripartite division of the personality, meaning three parts. Much of our behavior and awareness is influenced by the interplay of three intrapsychic processes or mental processes. That is the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is operated by the pleasure principle, meaning it seeks to maximize our pleasure. In contrast, the superego acts as our conscience, and it limits some of our pleasure seeking. And in the middle is the ego, and the ego operates on the reality principle, which seeks to maintain the self, and it is the one that decides the actions to take. So if you were to look at this diagram, you could probably identify the three parts here. We might oftentimes think of, the little devil and the angel that people think of that sit on their shoulders that tell us what to do. And so that corresponds with the libido and the superego's ideal. So the id is like that little devil that sits in your shoulder that says, I want it now. And the libido is a part of the id that is the desires that we seek. And so we'll talk about that a little more. And on the other side is the superego, and that says that's not how we ought to behave. And those standards are, I guess you could say, compose the ego ideal, or the expectations of society or expectations of self that one imposes on self, that says this is how you ought to be. And so that people might think of that as a conscience or whatever. And then there's ego. And the ego says, well, it decides I will have to wait. And that operates on the reality principle. It says this is what it's going to act. This is what reality says. You might have a fantasy about what you want, but reality says otherwise. So psychoanalysis is based on the assumption that we are motivated by the pleasure principle, which says that we seek to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. The id is an unconscious reservoir of primal energy that is present in our personality from birth, and is controlled by the pleasure principle. It directs the body to seek immediate gratification of its desires, though because it is unconscious, people are not generally aware of these urges. And so it operates from birth, and it becomes more and more controlled and masked as we get older. The libido, which is Latin for desire or lust, is part of the id and is the energy that motivates or drives us to fulfill our basic impulses or desires. In Freud's drive theory, humans are motivated by libido's drives, such as the desire for sex and aggression. The libido encompasses both sexual urges as well as survival instincts. The mind is constantly balancing the needs of the pleasure-seeking id and the superego or conscience, which contains our ego ideal, the internalization of family or society's ideals. The superego uses shame to keep people's drives in check and represses our exhibitionistic drives, the libidinal forces or our sexual impulses that would make us lose our own self-respect. So that's what superego is. It helps us to maintain our own integrity. So defense mechanisms are also an important part of Freud's theory of psychoanalysis. The conflicts between the demands of the id and the rules and restrictions of the superego lead to anxiety and shame for the ego, which uses defense mechanisms to deal with that anxiety and shame. So a psychological ego defense mechanisms are unconscious distortions of a person's reality to reduce stress and anxiety. So what does that mean? Well, if you've ever met somebody who gets defensive, or they blame other people, or they put their delusional ideas on you, or they think that you're the person in the wrong, these are ways of protecting themselves from painful awareness that they're doing something wrong, or maybe that they should feel ashamed about something. So people don't like that feeling of shame, so they protect themselves from it. So Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, elaborated on these on different types of defense mechanisms. These include repression, regression, reaction formation, isolation, undoing, projection, introjection. And introjection basically means it says, I ought to do this, like I'm not supposed to get angry, or that sort of thing. Projection means I put what I think about myself onto other people. Turning against one's own person, meaning you attack yourself, or reversal into the opposite, sublimation and displacement. Those are some technical terms, but they're all have interesting ideas behind them, which we don't have time in this class to go into, but if you're interested in psychoanalysis, you can definitely learn more about these defense mechanisms. I'll talk about some of the more common or more interesting defense mechanisms that you might want to know. One of them is repression. Repression is a defense that forces thoughts, feelings, or memories that cause anxiety to stay in the unconscious. So, for example, if you have shameful memories or traumatic memories or things you feel really embarrassed about, you're going to try and block that out of your memory. Then there's projection. That's when we assume others have the motives that we do because it makes us feel less bad about our own motives. That's projection. Rationalization offers justifications or explanations that substitute for our real reasons that we may feel ashamed of. So rather than saying, like, someone might have a racist or sexist prejudice about somebody, but rather than just acknowledging that they have fear and hate of that type of person, they will rationalize, oh, this person shouldn't have done that, or we need to maintain values of society or something like that. For example, the American Civil War was, rationalized on, rather than people saying, I want to maintain slavery, they said, oh, we got to defend state rights. And so that was all about an example of rationalization. We use justifications or explanations rather than the real reason, which is they want to have slaves. And so they didn't want to admit it. Defense mechanisms are a normal part of, and so all these are examples of defense mechanisms. And defense mechanisms are normal responses to protect humans from stressful situations that they cannot currently cope with. Just so you know, Americans and British spell defense differently. Okay, so if you see it differently, that's why. Americans spell it with an S, British spell it with a C. But it's basically saying the same thing. So Freud also introduced the concept of psychosexual stages of development. Let's talk about that next. Freud's psychoanalytic theory proposed that development proceeds through 5 stages of psychosexual development, in which the id seeks to fulfill its pleasure seeking. And in each stage, the id is focused on different areas of the body. And the acronym OPAL-G, remember OPAL-G, that'll help you remember the different stages of the psychosexual stages. OAPLG, OPAL-G, that will help you remember it. So what does that stand for? Freud believed that the libido's drive focused on these specific areas of the body one at a time. O stands for oral, and that's when the id dominates. A stands for anal, and that's when the ego develops. Then the P stands for phallic, and that's when the superego develops. And that's when Freud talked about the Oedipal and Electra complexes. It's when the child has fascination with a parent. And then there's the latent phase. It's not a specific body part. It's simply a sexual repression. And that's important because prior to the latent phase, children have a fascination with their parent, but that's obviously not going to be healthy in adulthood. So they have to go through a period in which sexuality is repressed before it then reemerges in an interest in other people their age. So after the latent phase is the genital phase. And so OPAL-G, the G stands for genital, and that is a general reawakening of appropriate sexual feelings. And that's when people start to develop their sexuality. So for Freud, shame was related to being found out or exposed, which he links to genital exposure when humans first became upright. According to Freud, fixation occurs when conflicts are not fully resolved during a particular stage, which results in an adult developing personality characteristics that reflect the childhood inadequacies. That's why you might have heard people say, "Oh, that person's anal." That's the idea that they're stuck in their anal phase. That's actually where that that phrase comes from. And some might use it as an insult, but it comes from psychology. But the idea is that we can get stuck or fixed at any particular phase of our development. So Freud, followers of Freud also developed ways to measure or assess personality from a psychoanalytic perspective. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist who founded analytic psychology. And he originally a follower of Freud, he used word associations to assess or access patients' unconscious minds. So he asked people to say the first thing that came to their mind when presented with words. So if you think about Freud was all about free association, talk freely. Carl Jung was about word association. And so it's about just mention the first word that comes to your mind. And so he used that to assess people's personality. After that, Hermann Rorschach, who lived from 1884 to 1922, was a Swiss psychoanalyst with an education in art. And just so you know, if you can notice, he didn't live very long, but he had many great ideas. He only lived to about 36 or something like that. 38? Anyway, but he was great ideas, and it's too bad he didn't live that long. He modified Jung's approach to use ink blots instead. So Carl Jung used word association, Rorschach used ink blots. And so he believed that what people saw in the ink said something about what was in your unconscious mind and your personality. So he showed people a series of ink blots and recorded their answers to draw conclusions about their personality. Now the test, of course, it's been criticized for being unreliable or unscientific. And so people don't use it like maybe he did, but it can be useful for starting conversations for further assessment. So psychologists still use the ink blot test, but mainly just to start up conversations that help us to get an idea of what a person's like. But obviously, you'd have to use other objective measures, which we've talked about before. Projective tests are used by psychoanalysts based on the defense mechanism of projection. And so the idea is that you're going to project your thoughts onto these kinds of things. The most classic type includes the Rorschach ink blot test and the thematic apperception test. They've been criticized for being low in reliability and validity and may be more useful in finding starting points to open a dialogue between a therapist and client. Let's talk about the people that followed Freud, the neo-Freudians. Carl Jung, as I mentioned before, was originally a friend of Freud, but believed that sexual desires were only part of the equation. He believed that we are also motivated to have a complete knowledge of ourselves, and that would motivate people. So he developed the theory of the collective unconscious, which is shared by all humans. Jung considered this to be the collective unconscious to be populated by instincts and archetypes, or universal symbols that can be found in world religions, ancient mythology, and dreams. If you think about how all the religions may have common themes and symbols that are shared, and he believes this is all part of the collective unconscious that is passed down through generation to generation from a evolutionary perspective. If you think about movies that have been popular throughout the past few decades, there are oftentimes really popular movies that strike a chord with the popular generations, like popular society, like Harry Potter, or the big one today are comic book movies like Justice League or Marvel Comics and DC Comics and things like that. They're very popular because they resonate with people. And so Carl Jung would talk about how these archetypes are very popular, and they're seen in movies and classic literature. So some of these may be like Star Wars and The Matrix or Lord of the Rings and others. Here's Wizard of Oz. And it's been considered that all these movies have a specific type of plot that go through it. And so Wizard of Oz is a classic example of this typical plot. And here is, which I'll talk about in a second. As you remember, there are superheroes and knights in medieval time that the stories were very popular about. And all these are tapped into our archetypes. And Joseph Campbell, who took Jung's ideas and applied it to movies and literature and myths, he wrote the book The Power of Myth and did a television documentary series that was very popular in his time, with Bill Moyers. And he introduced this idea of the hero's journey. And it basically is that all these popular stories and myths introduce a character that goes through a radical transformation, which is interesting. We're going to talk about transformation. But basically, they all follow similar themes. They go through challenges. They meet up with a goddess of some sort. They have a call to adventure. They have some kind of like supernatural aid or some intervention from the universe. Then there is then they cross the threshold back. The threshold is between normal life and the adventure. And then there's always some kind of helper along the way, and that sort of thing. So anyway, this diagram shows that typical cycle. It starts at the top, starts out with a call to adventure, and then they cross the threshold. They go into this abyss and this death and rebirth. It's interesting because Christianity talks about rebirth a lot. People go through a transformation and they meet up with the divine and they return to the normal life. And so he believes that these kinds of patterns are universal across all religions. Freud did not, so continuing on with Neo-Freudian psychology, there is this idea of ego psychology. Freud did not develop a sense of self in his theory. Remember, he talked about the id, the ego, and superego, but all these are little different parts of the self. He didn't really have a sense of the whole self in his theory. So that's why his method or his theory is called ego psychology, because there's emphasis on the ego, which is the part of the self. However, others began to see the important role of the self, which is a little bigger in concept. Alfred Adler developed the first cognitive theory of personality and saw the need for self-esteem as providing motivation. Alfred Adler also believed that childhood was important, but he emphasized the ongoing social tensions as crucial to personality. So he proposed that feelings of inferiority were the driving force behind personality. He conceptualized that shame as an individual was a static property of an individual. So he believed that one could have a sense of inferiority or they could be confident. And everybody has a scale of confidence or self-esteem in them. Erik Erikson was also an ego psychologist who developed a psychosocial theory that social interactions with others shape the development of personality. And so you need to know Erik Erikson because he's his theories are very popular, and it's something that people have to know. The theory, Erik Erikson's theory is Neo-Freudian because he's still in the psychoanalytic tradition, but it modifies it. The core concept of his theory is ego identity. So if you think Alfred Adler focused on the self, Erik Erikson talked about ego identity. It was a modification of psychoanalysis. He focused on ego identity, which is basic sense of self, or who we are as individuals and our qualities. Erikson's theory differs from Freud in that it emphasizes conscious forces, or how we think about ourselves, rather than less attention to the unconscious side. It looks at how we develop our sense of self and how we actively engage in that process. So Erikson's theory is based on psychosocial stages rather than sexual relationships that cover the entire lifespan. So Freud focused on early childhood and psychosexual stages. Erikson's theory is psychosocial stages that go from birth to death. And so Erikson's stages include, starting in infancy, this concept of trust versus mistrust. And then in toddlerhood, there is this challenge to develop a sense of autonomy versus shame. Then there is initiative versus guilt in early childhood. In the middle childhood, they develop a sense of industry. So let me back up a little just to give you an idea what these mean. So in trust versus mistrust, infants are learning to trust their caregivers, which is really important for their survival. But then once they develop that sense of trust and their caregivers, then they can start to walk and explore their world. That's part of that sense of autonomy. They want to be able to do things. So rather than being fed, toddlers want to feed themselves. They want that sense of autonomy. They also learn to say no. No! You might hear kids say that a lot. That's also important for developing their sense of autonomy. And then they learn to take initiative in early childhood. That means they start to explore and get into all the wrong things. And that's when parents have to teach them boundaries. But the challenge is to encourage their initiative without shaming them or making them feel guilty for doing the wrong thing. So autonomy is contrasted with shame, whereas initiative is contrasted with guilt. Then during middle childhood, they start to learn to take on chores and responsibilities as they care for their other siblings or they care for their house, and they get involved. And that's a sense of an industry. Otherwise, without it, they may feel inferior. So giving them a sense that they're responsible helps them to feel that they're capable. Then during adolescence, that's when all adolescents start to develop their sense of identity. Who are they? Otherwise, if they don't develop their sense of identity, they experience role confusion. And that's when they start to want to fit in with particular peer groups and that sort of thing. Then in young adulthood, young adults are often interested in intimacy and romantic relationships, although they may also be in adolescence, but adolescents are more interested in relationships as it pertains to their identity, whereas young adults are more interested in open intimacy and companionship and relationships. Otherwise, they experience isolation. And so they're not, adolescents may be all about superficial relationships and collecting a lot of friends, whereas young adults are more interested in quality friends. Middle adults are starting to want to develop a sense of generativity. They want to know that their life has purpose and meaning, and they want to accomplish things and accomplish their bucket list and that sort of thing. Otherwise, they experience stagnation and frustration. And lastly, older adults are, as they start to experience declines in their health and their abilities and strength, their concern is primarily about ego integrity, meaning holding on to oneself as they start to depend on other people around them. Otherwise, they may experience despair. And so those are the psychosocial stages of Erikson. These stages represent markers in developing one's identity and maintaining their self-esteem. Erikson believed that the beginning stages were critical in introducing mistrust versus trust and shame, which can affect someone throughout their life. Shame and autonomy precedes guilt and initiative. So it's interesting. Autonomy is required before you can experience initiative. You have to know you have the ability to say no before you can say yes. That's what I oftentimes think about. And people oftentimes confuse shame and guilt. And so that may also be related to those stages. Others have observed that all of Erikson's stages represent a verbal transformation or elaboration on the same thing, which is shame. If you look at all the things, shame is at the root of it, really. There is inferiority, which is about shame about yourself. Role confusion, which is shame about your identity. Isolation, which is shame about your lack of relationships. Stagnation, which is shame about not accomplishing things. And then there's despair, which is also similar. Helen Lind expounded on Erikson by showing that shame is embedded in our search for identity and our consciousness of the whole self. So let's look at some current thoughts on psychodynamic perspectives. Current research has found some support for psychodynamic theories of defense mechanisms and the unconscious mind that can influence conscious behavior. However, some of the concepts, like the unconscious in general, a lot of these things haven't been established scientifically. Like, what is the difference between the id and the superego? It's really hard to establish that as having a particular location in the brain. We do know that there's emotional centers, but that may not divide the id and the superego, for example. We do know that there's emotions versus the frontal cortex of the brain versus the limbic system. So there's some of that, but it may not be aligned with the way Freud conceptualized it. Freud studied development of children from the perspective of disturbed adults who were often victims of abuse so the importance of healthy early attachments was ignored. We're going to talk about that. He tended to pathologize normal, healthy behaviors such as self-esteem, and that's why Alfred Adler wanted to bring renewed attention to self-esteem. Freud typically thought of self-esteem as narcissistic, whereas we know that self-esteem is important. A focus on internal drives, Freud's drives, has been replaced by a focus today on emotions or affect, which is the biological emotional response, and these respond to external changes in environment. So emotions are responses to external changes. The focus today, or the focus in psychoanalysis on a damaged self-esteem. However, not all bad feelings of shame are a reflection of damaged self-esteem. Often we experience shame as this is related to psychosocial stages, I should say. So in the Neo-Freudian approach, they tend to focus on self-esteem. However, not all bad feelings of shame are a reflection of a damaged self-esteem. Some people can have shame and yet still have a good sense of self-esteem. So often we experience shame as an emotional response to specific failures, and self-esteem is not an emotional response. So it's more of a confidence about oneself. But repeated failures can certainly chip away at our self-esteem. Okay, let's look at object relations theory. Object relations theory looks at our concept of ourselves. So whereas Freud and the Neo-Freudians were primarily interested in or Freud was definitely more interested in the ego, others after him started to develop that sense of self. So Freud was more focused on the ego, as I said, as an agent responding to an external reality rather than a concept of self. Freud's approach is referred to as ego psychology, which was expanded on by Anna Freud. So Charles Horton Cooley also described the concept of the self as a looking glass self. That means we see ourselves in a mirror. It reminds me of Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 13, we see ourselves dimly in a mirror, for example. Cooley says that this looking glass sense of self shows how people are able to reflect on their own self and their own behavior. We are able to take a look at ourselves. Oftentimes we see ourselves as if we are in a mirror. People judge themselves based on their belief about what others see in them. And so based on how we perceive others to see us, that's how we oftentimes judge ourselves. And that's why relationships are important to our developing our sense of self. William James, the father of American psychology, is one of the first to deal with the self. He differentiated the concept of self from the ego as a difference between, now remember Freud talked about the ego, so he differentiated self from that as a difference between I and me. So in the statement, I know it was me who ate the cookie, he would call the me part of the self the empirical me, or and the I part the pure ego. So the self is that concept of oneself, whereas the I, and so we might talk about ourselves in third person, that would be the me, whereas the I is the ego that plays a part of how we form these concepts to begin with. Both Cooley and James developed the idea of the self as an object to be observed, and that we make judgments about the self that are based on what we believe others to see. And James expanded on this idea that the self is involved in making meaning. So if you look at this picture of a person looking at a mirror, the person is the I, and the me is the person in the mirror. We might think of the self as this concept in the mirror where we have this concept about ourselves, whereas the ego is the one that's involved in making meaning about ourselves and developing that sense of self. Heinz Kohut was a psychoanalyst who developed self-psychology within the psychodynamic tradition. Kohut considered maintaining self-esteem as an important goal in maintaining feelings of security and well-being. So if you think about that, looking in the picture, looking in the mirror at ourselves, their self-concept, self-esteem then is to think positive about ourselves. So a therapist who's practicing this might encourage someone to talk to the mirror. And I've done this with my clients. I'll have somebody talk to the mirror and say good things to the person in the mirror as a way to help bolster the self-esteem. Well, there's some downsides. It doesn't always work, but that's one method that people can use. And however, in contrast to other self-esteem models before him, Kohut's major contribution was the central role of the self as a product of subjective experiences and relationships with others. So that sense of self, he would say, is a product of how we relate to others and our experiences with people. So let's talk about, that brings us to the role of the self in relationships and how relationships influence the sense of self. While Freud was focused on drives, others believed that people are motivated by a relationship with people. Harry Stack Sullivan was a neo-Freudian psychoanalyst who developed interpersonal psychodynamic therapy as a result of clinical observations that showed the importance of relationships. He described the self as having a role in personality and behavior through the self system. The self system is formed through relationships with caretakers where the individual internalizes the values of the caretaker in order to win the approval of the caretaker. So we want to please people. So we figure out how to do that. We figure out how we can feel good about ourselves. And he believed that the self is affected by the environment through those emotional experiences. So if you know that other people like it when you're a joker or when you're quiet or whatever, then you're going to respond accordingly, and then you're going to develop your sense of self based on the environment. So all these things contribute to how the environment and our experiences shape our sense of self. But now we want to talk about our concept of other. How does our concept of others affect our personality as well? And that brings us to object relations theory. Object relations theory is about how people perceive other people. While Sullivan's interpersonal approach focuses on the development of the self in relationship to others, others focus on how the self responds to others. So it's more about the concept of others, not so much about the self in relationships. So object relations theory again modifies Freud's psychoanalysis in saying that human connection and relatedness, not sexual pleasure, are the primary motivators for human behavior. So we're moving away from Freudian's emphasis on sex, and that's why psychodynamic therapy and object relations theory are focused more on relationships as motivators. Melanie Klein is the one that I think really coined this term. And so Klein's object relations theory says that the self, or the psyche is the psychological term for the self, develops in relationship to others in the environment, particularly during childhood. And people also have internalized objects, this concept of self and other people. So if you look at this diagram I created just to help make it easy to understand. So we have concepts about people that we call objects. We have an object about the self, we call it the self object, and we have objects about the other, and we call that the other object. And basically it just means we have internalized working models of self and other. That brings us to attachment theory. Attachment theory is also in the same vein and talks about similar concepts. John Bowlby was a psychoanalyst who focusing on child development. He believed that relationships are important for human development and survival. And his attachment theory is known as the theory of love, which we're going to also talk about more when we get to the chapter on interpersonal relationships. John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth showed that the self develops through relationship attachments starting at birth. So attachments are essential for our survival starting when we're babies. And in the middle of the slide, there's a picture by George King of an Eskimo family. It just illustrates how children depend on other people in their relationships for their survival. Mary Ainsworth was a researcher following Bowlby that found that children established 4 kinds of relationships with their caregivers or caretakers, known as attachment styles. And over time, she and others developed these 4 basic styles. There's a secure style, ambivalent style, avoidant, and fearful. But basically, they can summarize, the last 3 can be summarized as insecure. So there's an insecure and secure attachment. But insecure can be broken into ambivalent, avoidant, and fearful. So we all have we can be insecure. Whereas in contrast, the previous people, like the Neo-Freudians, when they use the word insecure, they're really talking about an insecurity about oneself. Whereas Ainsworth's sense of insecurity was more about our relationship with other people, not about ourselves. But so an insecure attachment would be about whether other people are not reliable. And so she believed that these insecure or secure attachments were formed as a result of how responsive our caregivers were. So if our caregivers were responsive to our needs, like when we cried, they came and provided for our needs, then we knew that other people were reliable and that we were worthy of being cared for. When other people are not reliable or they abuse us or whatever, then we start to develop a sense that other people are unreliable or that we are not worthy of being cared for. So that brings us to this quadrant model that's commonly used in attachment theory. And that basically looks at how we can have positive or negative thoughts of ourselves, and we can have positive or negative thoughts about other people. And when we combine that, we can combine these 2 dimensions into 4 quadrants. So if you have a positive sense of self and other, you have secure relationships. If you have a negative sense of self but a positive sense of others, you tend to be more anxious because you're preoccupied with the other person. If you have a positive sense of self but a negative sense of others, then you're going to think you're fine but dismiss and avoid intimacy with other people because other people are a threat to yourself. And then lastly, there are many people who have a negative sense of self and a negative sense of others. And those people tend to be victims of abuse or others, but that's because they sense that they depended on other people, but that other people were unreliable and that they weren't worthy of being cared for. And so they end up with a fearful, mixed attachment style. Yeah. And so that also can cause relationship problems, even into adulthood. So if the mother was consistently available, the child would develop an internal working model of other that they can trust in their mother when she's absent. Our internal working model of self is constructed as a mirror reflection of our interactions with others. Again, this will be discussed later more in depth. So let's talk about some current thoughts on object relations and attachment theory. The role of relationships is now acknowledged in the development of self. Research shows that attachment styles have lifelong impacts on adult relationships, but the weaknesses of these approaches is that the development of these concepts is mostly theoretical and hasn't done a lot of testing. Ainsworth, though, her attachment styles and others were developed. Those were more empirically based, but other things prior to it were not really empirically based. So let's talk about how we could apply this to our life today. I'm at a playground today because I'm looking at how our past affects our present. If you want to have a secure, happy and healthy relationship, oftentimes we need to look at how our past experiences affect our present. And especially if you have unresolved wounds that maybe need to be worked through and healed through therapy or whatever, or forgiveness. Sometimes we need to work through those in order to have secure relationships. If we're looking to resolve the past, we may be trying to find that resolution through current relationships. And or we may be reacting to people as if they're people from our past. So if we want to have healthy relationships, oftentimes it's important to take care of our past as well. So that brings us to spirituality. You know, when I was younger, I used to complain that religion was all boring. It was all about, giving up things. And I felt like I missed out on all the fun. My friends were all having wild parties. Now I look back and I realize, okay, well, maybe it's a good thing I didn't do what they did. But when a lot of young people complain that religion is all about what you give up, and it's about repressing desires rather than what we embrace and fulfilling our desires. And for many people, that's what religion is about repression. And it doesn't feel very uh, joyful. It doesn't really lead to it doesn't really make us feel happy and have that peace. And if we do find change, and oftentimes if we make changes, it's incremental at best. And sometimes we're white knuckling it. That means like we're holding on tight, and we end up with white knuckles, trying to do the right thing and not do the wrong thing. But that's just ultimately it feels very unsatisfying, and people burn out because of that. It's not sustainable. And so, how do we experience joy in our lives? I believe that there is a way. Unfortunately, too many people in both religion and psychology oftentimes think that our natural desires and our conscience, like the id and the superego, are at war with each other, or they're opposed to each other. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can find a way where we can reconcile our desires and our conscience so that we can actually embrace our desires and have what we want and feel happy. It's not about repression, but seeking what we want. But the only way to get there is when we have a radical change, a fully complete transformation. What if our desires and our conscience could be aligned with each other? That may require transformation of our desires and our conscience, or both, but it is possible. So how can we have our desires and conscience aligned with each other? Many people, as I said, think that they are in conflict with each other. So just as Freud described the conflict between the id and the superego, the Bible also talks about a conflict between the flesh and the spirit. In Galatians, Paul writes, "For the flesh desires what is contrary to the spirit, and the spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want." You don't want, and if we think about this in Freudian terms, he would say that there's a conflict between the superego and the id. Don't just do whatever the id wants. You need to have some principles. But if you're led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. But that's an interesting point here that brings us, that we want to explore more, because a lot of people think that this conflict leads to legalism and white knuckling things and trying. But he's saying that if we allow the Spirit to change us, then we may not really experience this conflict as we think. And he continues, he also writes elsewhere in Romans, he says, "For when we were in the realm of the flesh, the sinful passions aroused by the law, the id, as we might think, were at work within us, so that we bore fruit for death." He would say, "I am unspiritual, sold as a slave to sin." That's our natural selves. We are naturally bound to be impulsive and to act according to our id. And we oftentimes do not operate according to our own ideals. And so why is that? Now, there are two reasons why we experience a misalignment between our conscience and our desires. The first reason, so if we think about it, if there's a misalignment, that could be one side is wrong. The first reason is that our conscience is wrong. We need to understand that a superego, here's a key that I want to also explain. The superego is really not the same as our spiritual conscience. Freud believed that the superego represents the ideals we've internalized from others in society, but our family and society could also be wrong. So how do we know that our superego is really telling us what is really right and wrong? Too often, our cultures have imposed taboos that were not necessarily correct. For example, people oftentimes repress their sexual desires and things like that, when reality is that maybe the sexual desires weren't necessarily wrong. People oftentimes think that sexuality is evil, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. People will put up with abuse or shame themselves for normal feelings when they do not need to feel guilty. And so some of the most dangerous people in the world today are the morally elite, who seek to impose their conscience on others and to persecute people who are convicted differently. Religion has often been used to justify oppression, the Crusades, and slavery. So, in the beginning of Christianity, Saul of Tarsus, who is later known by his Greek name Paul, was a powerful and highly educated Pharisee dedicated to the murder and bloody persecution of followers of Jesus Christ. Saul had approved of the stoning of Stephen. This is a painting of the killing of Stephen, who when he was killed, he had a vision of Jesus as he was being executed, and he prayed for the forgiveness of his killers. Can you imagine that? But then, breathing out murderous threats, you can imagine Saul must have felt guilty or something. He was raging even more. He was breathing out murderous threats. And as he did that, Saul set out on the road to Damascus to persecute even more Christians. On the way, Saul saw a vision of Jesus and fell to the ground. He heard a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And he says, "Who are you, Lord? Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. And he hears, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Basically saying all the people he's persecuting, he's essentially persecuting Jesus. And Saul also recounts in another place that he heard, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads." What does that mean? Goads were ancient spurs used to prod oxen to move. And this saying implies that Saul had been resisting the Spirit moving on his conscience, and it was only hurting him. So it's quite possible that our Saul thought he was doing the right thing. He thought he was the morally elite, and he was just looking out for society. It's quite possible that our conscience is actually not correctly attuned, as we see here. He was kicking against his own conscience. Our conscience could be hyperactive, meaning it's too critical, or hypoactive, meaning it's not critical enough. Perhaps we shame natural desires and seek to impose our incorrect assumptions on others, meaning we're hyperactive, or perhaps our conscience is dead to the Spirit, or hypoactive. Some people will argue that their conscience is clear. "Oh, my conscience is clear," when others believe that what they're doing is clearly wrong. And that's why Paul writes, "My conscience is clear, but that doesn't make me innocent. It's the Lord who judges me." Ellen White also summarizes, "But the question is, has the man a well-instructed, good conscience, or is it biased and warped by his own preconceived opinions? Conscience is not to take the place of a 'thus saith the Lord.' Consciences do not all harmonize and are not all inspired alike. Some consciences are dead, seared as with a hot iron. Men may be conscientiously wrong as well as conscientiously right. Paul did not believe in Jesus of Nazareth, and he hunted the Christians from city to city, verily believing that he was doing the service to God." Can you imagine? Many Christians today think that they are doing the right thing by persecuting people. They think that their moral elitism is going to lead them to do the right thing. And, many of us can find ourselves falling into the same pattern. But how do we know what is right from wrong? Perhaps that's where we need to walk closely with God and have some standards of right and wrong to compare with. Perhaps the best standard to compare with is Jesus. That's why Christians oftentimes ask themselves, what would Jesus do in this situation? The religion of Jesus softens whatever is hard and rough into temper and smooths whatever is rugged and sharp into manners. It makes the words gentle and the demeanor winning. Let us learn from Christ how to combine a high sense of purity and integrity with sunniness of disposition. A kind, courteous Christian is the most powerful argument that can be produced in favor of Christianity. Wow, this one's a hard one for me because, I oftentimes lean on one or the other. I would say I probably tend to lean more on that sense of purity and integrity, but when you're always focused on that, you can end up being critical of others. And so that's why I like how she said we want to balance with sunniness, joy and cheerfulness. We don't want to be always having a frown on our face. We want to be smiling and happy, and that's says something too. So the second reason for a misalignment between our desires and our conscience is that our desires could be wrong. And that leads us to the understanding of sin, because essentially sin is misplaced desire. The Bible describes humans as both innately broken and created as perfect in God's image. But how did Adam and Eve go from obedience, being perfectly created, to disobedience? From being naked without shame to living in shame? We may never really understand what led Eve to wander into dangerous ground near the tree of knowledge, but we can see the steps that brought her into sin. So in the previous chapter, we talked about how our brokenness, sin, is like a disease that gets transmitted from generation to generation. Sin is also, if we look at it in the context of this chapter, sin is also an unconscious process of misplacing our desires that is rooted in our past experiences. So with this concept of the libido, Freud talked about the role that our desires play in influencing our personalities and behavior, for good or bad. Unfortunately, often our desires for common and healthy needs, such as relationships or sex, can cause us to respond in ways that are not productive or healthy for us. So that takes us to the first point. Sin begins as a seed that grows. Eve did not just one day decide to disobey. Certainly, neither God nor Adam told her to. Somehow, she found herself near this tempter in the Garden of Eden, and this crafty serpent placed the seed of doubt in her head. Doubt, what is doubt? Doubt is a tempter's hook. James writes that the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea and tossed by the wind. Both Jesus and James describes a doubter as being double-minded. The serpent suggested, "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Essentially, Satan implied that God was withholding something great from her, possibly out of selfish reasons. And essentially, the serpent was questioning the character of God. This was a lie, essentially, but it created a distrust and a trauma in their relationship. So at the root of sin really is a lack of faith or trust in God's character. It starts with the shaming lie, and it raises the question of how do we cope with that? So the story continues in Genesis 3:6. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, then the story says that she took the fruit from the tree. And this is my wife illustrating that. So what did Eve do wrong? Well, she could have taken her desire for wisdom and asked God, but apparently she didn't trust God and she took her desire elsewhere. She took it literally into her own hands. So that's the second point, that sin misplaces our otherwise normal desires away from God rather than asking God for help. James tells us that if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who will give generously to all without finding fault, and will be given to him. It reminds me of a time when I didn't trust God to fulfill my need for relationships, a romantic relationship at the time. And because I didn't trust God, I kept doing the wrong things, trying to make it happen. But then someone's pointed out to me, maybe I should just surrender it and trust God. So when I did, I remember praying, okay, God, if you want me to be if you want me to be happy being single, I will be single and happy for the rest of my life. Well, 6 months later, I was being happy being single, but then I met my wife. And because I had been more secure about it, I was much more successful in building a relationship with her. So we just need to trust God sometimes, but sometimes we don't. And so we have that choice we have to make. We can choose to trust or we can choose to doubt. And whatever choice we make will result in some kind of action. And that's the third and fourth point. So the fourth point is that we ultimately decide to act to get that desire met or not. James says that each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires, as Freud would call this the libido, and enticed. And when that libido or that desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Why? That's pretty strong. Why would something like that bring forth death? Well, if you think about it, many people are addicted to substances or, gambling or some kind of damaging process. Maybe many people are looking for pleasure, but in the process, that pleasure only brings shame and guilt, and it makes them feel bad. But in order to compensate and make themselves feel better, they often go back to that same thing that makes them felt bad to begin with. And it's a downward spiral that ultimately leads to more and more destructive behavior. And that's why it says death. And ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, on a larger human level, sin leads to death in general. So when this woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. And she also gave some to her husband, who was also with her, and he ate it. So that brings us to the next point. Sin is a disease that grows, becomes progressively worse, and we share it with others. It's contagious. So here's a picture of my wife sharing that fruit with me, just to illustrate that principle. What did Adam do wrong? Well, he wasn't deceived, according to 1 Timothy 2:14, but rather he chose to put his wife above God. And his desire was for his wife, obviously, but rather than trusting that God would take care of the situation, he followed her into that sin. So his fear was of losing his wife, but he decided to take control into his own hands. And, these behaviors are really prototypical for all of humanity, really. There are some people who are more codependent and some people are more counterdependent, that sort of thing. But they're very typical behaviors. And at that moment, their eyes were open and they suddenly felt shame at their nakedness. So sin makes us feel shamed. In the Bible, shame is equivalent to nakedness. That's that symbolism. So here's a picture of my wife and I looking like we're ashamed. So sin is involved in this process that includes shame. And the shame contributes to greater misplacement of desire as we try to take away that shame. So that's the 6th point. Sin causes us to feel shame, blame, and they blamed each other, and they tried to hide. As the Bible says, they hid from the Lord God among the trees. And even though God eventually expelled them from the Garden of Eden, he did not totally withdraw his presence from them. Unfortunately, we withdraw ourselves from God. And so we then see how this process gets passed on from generation to generation as it affects their children, and Cain and Abel, and that sort of thing. But shame, what is shame really? That's probably that they're afraid of being exposed. As God went looking for them, they were hiding literally in the bushes because they're afraid of what God would think when he found them. So as I said, shame causes that sin causes that blaming each other as they seek to avoid attention to their responsibility. And they literally run and hide and separate themselves. I know when I've had friends who suddenly disappear, sometimes I think it's because I know that they're doing something wrong. So how do we overcome this? How do we get out of this cycle? Ultimately, we want to, many people will try hard to stop sinning by just trying harder. And that's what Paul would call being under the law. The problem with that, it just makes people burned out. But the good news is that there's another way. But that's simply through a fundamental transformation of our desires and our consciousness so that they're aligned. And Jesus talked about this when he was talking to Nicodemus. Nicodemus came in the cover of night, literally, to ask Jesus what must he do to be saved. And Jesus says, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again. And he also says, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless they're born of water and the Spirit. Basically, they need to be reborn. And he had a hard time understanding what that meant. But what does that mean? Really, he needs to experience a fundamental change. But many people do not want to experience change because people are afraid of change. That the unknown is frightening. But there's a question, can humans even change at all? Many people think that, we're a product of biology or genes and that we're predetermined to be a certain way and that's the way they're always going to be. And when we do not believe people can change, it leads to us as a society to be very unforgiving. We condemn people for something they did decades prior. But the good news is sometimes we will change even when we don't even realize it. We oftentimes go through experiences that change us who we are as people. For example, I hate to think of who I was when I was a young man. I tended to be narcissistic, self-absorbed, argumentative, all these things. But I may always have a human propensity toward those things. But I also know that I'm not anywhere near the same person I was when I was younger. Even my wife says that if she had met me when I was younger, she probably wouldn't even married me. But why? What changed me? I believe that relationships change us, and we change naturally because of the relationships with people we care about. When I married my wife, who is a different ethnicity, it really helped me to see the world through her eyes. And in the same way, when I was as a result of a relationship with God rather than a religion, it also helped me to see things the way God would see. The story of Christianity really is a story about how people change because of a relationship. If you think about Saul's encounter with Jesus, it really changed him because before that encounter, Saul was persecuting and killing Christians. But as a result of this new relationship, he became such a different person that he went from being a persecutor of Christians to being its staunchest defender and author of most of the New Testament. And then he was eventually executed himself for his firm faith and even counted it as a glory to suffer. Sometimes due to our own stubbornness, we have to learn lessons the hard way. But thankfully, as Ellen White says, this is even sometimes due to God's mercy toward us. She writes, "It is in mercy that the Lord reveals to us our hidden defects. He would have them critically examine the complicated emotions and motives of our own hearts and detect that which is wrong, modify their dispositions, and refine their manners. God would have his servants become acquainted with their own hearts. In order to bring them to a true knowledge of their condition, he permits the fire of affliction to assail them so that they may be purified." And basically, he allows us to go through hard times so that we can become better people. It will change us. Sometimes when we hit rock bottom and feel in despair about our condition, the only way sometimes, I often tell people who hit rock bottom, I tell them, when you're down, there's only one way up, and that's up. So that's the good news, and oftentimes people who are at the bottom are the closest to God because they know that they need help. And so when we're in that situation, we may echo the cry of Romans 7:24, when Paul writes, "Who will deliver me from this body of death?" He says, "Thanks be to Jesus, for he rescues me." There is hope. As Ellen White continues, she says, Christ says, "I will take your sins. I will give you peace. I have bought you with my blood. You are mine. My grace shall strengthen your weakened will. Your remorse for sin I will remove. When temptations assail you, when care and perplexity surround you, when depressed and discouraged you are ready to yield to despair, look to Jesus, and the darkness that encompasses you will be dispelled by the bright shining of his presence. When sin struggles for the mastery in your soul and burdens a conscience, look to the Savior. His grace is sufficient to subdue sin. Let your grateful heart, trembling with uncertainty, turn to him. Lay hold on the hope set before you. Christ waits to adopt you into his family. His strength will help your weakness. He will lead you step by step. Place your hand in His and let Him guide you. God's forgiveness helps us to reset and clear our conscience again. We no longer need to feel under judgment, but we can experience peace again despite our failings. We can discover joy that comes through a relationship with Jesus and experiencing His grace. With that being said, change is possible, but many times change takes time and it doesn't always happen overnight. But in conclusion, we can believe that we can experience real joy and peace in our lives, and that we can experience a fundamental change in our lives so that our conscience and our desires are in alignment, and so that we can have true joy and have the ultimate desires met in our lives. And so that's the lesson for today. I hope you can join us for our next chapter, fitting in on the social and cultural side of ourselves. How does our external environment influence who we are? And we have some interesting points there. I hope you can join us as we continue on this journey of higher change. Thank you.